This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about character descriptions, and this is from a listener's question. She wanted to know how to better write descriptions, especially character descriptions. So by that, we're talking about your narrative voice, narrative descriptions, showing the reader who this character is using the power of voice on the page. So not dialogue, not action. And this is an important tool for all of us to have because you cannot avoid narrative exposition in any story, no matter how hard some writers may try. So how to bring your narrative to life and describe without just flatly saying, Joe has brown hair, Joe has dark eyes and nice teeth, and right?
I always have them look in the mirror and study themselves and wonder about their fine nose.
Yes. Yes, he straightened his tie and yeah. Do either of you struggle with character descriptions?
I don't think. I mean, yes.
Yeah.
I don't think there's an easy way to because you in your brain you're picturing this person and you want to say, what they look like, but it's so hard to not use those really cliche or trite ways of trying to just get the information on the page. In my most recent book I'm working on, my character's a twin, so I describe the twin.
Oh, clever.
And they're male-female twins, but they're, you're gonna know they're gonna look similar because they're twins. But that was me going, oh, I have a shortcut. Realizing that in the moment. But it is really, really hard to not just put something stupid in there and feel stupid while you're doing it. That's the biggest part, is you're doing it going, this is awful.
That's
and not overdo it for the reader as well, because there's nothing worse than the author then midway through the book suddenly giving a more full description of their character and they're nothing like what you had imagined them. Oh,
right.
They're only 4'6". No.
I know, right? Or my favorite, the height one is the hardest one for me. My favorite is when all of a sudden they're tall, and you're like, wait a second, when did they get tall? Why is she this tall? I don't understand why she's this tall. And that one bugs me a lot.
I had an editor come back to me because I'd specifically said that Indy is almost 2 meters tall because she grew up in a lot of low gravity environments, so she's naturally been able to be a little bit taller. And I'm imagining the humans, as we evolve, each generation is taller than the last, so we're going to just keep getting taller. And then she goes to this other planet she goes to a moon, I think, where people are much shorter and there's some action happening. And my editor came back to me and said, look, I don't get this. She's in the middle of this crowd, right? And she's got this flaming red hair and she's almost 2 meters tall and everyone else is about a foot shorter than her. How come they don't spot her?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Whoops.
Right, exactly.
Right. Well, this raises a good point that introducing characters to your reader is critical. And that is why when you read a novel, as soon as someone is introduced, you get a sense of a visual on this character. So you don't want to just sort of bypass your description while you don't want to plunk down an info dump. Here's Joe. Joe is
right.
da-da-da-da-da. You do want to establish a visual because it is disruptive for a reader to get halfway through a book and go, what? Wait, now I have to revise my mental picture. This is not at all who I thought this character was. And there are lots of ways to weave things in through characters' action without simply, standing them in front of a mirror, running fingers through hair, adjusting the way glasses sit on the face, fussing with clothing or picking up a bag. So all of these things give us a picture of a person. If your character picks up a bicycle messenger bag, that's a different image than if the character picks up a huge calf leather tote with rhinestones on it, or, you know, a hard-sided briefcase, or whatever you do. So when you do your character's description, don't just do facial features. Think of the full-bodied picture. One of the exercises I like to have people do is to go into a coffee shop and sit there and people watch. Mm-hmm. So when you see someone come in, just on that first impression, just on the visual, you can create a sense of who this person is and what kind of life they live based on how they present themselves in public.
I can just imagine going into a cafe, there's like 10 authors in there, and you walk in, what's going on?
Why is everyone watching me?
That's right. They're all frantically scribbling.
Right. Taking notes. Right. That's funny. That would be great. But then introduce your character to your reader the same way. If your character walks into a cafe and your reader is sitting there and notices your character, what impression is your character making? What is the hairdo that day? What is the wardrobe? What is on the body? Is it a cell phone stuck to the ear? Is it, a yoga mat in a bag? Is it what, so that's a good way to get out of the headshot mindset where you're just describing face and hair.
Well, and I think a lot of times we want to say eye color, that sort of thing. Drives me crazy. I don't care what color the character's eyes are. I don't even know how half my friends' eye colors are. It's not something you notice in day-to-day life. So those things, it's more body language or, type of
mannerisms.
Like you said, mannerisms. Clothing. That really matters, and height, apparently, because apparently my pet peeve is height. But, something where you can visualize them just enough to keep going. You don't need to know all the nitty-gritty details.
Right, and as with setting, so also with a character, you want to pick out a few distinguishing traits. I mean, could we have Harry Potter without the lightning bolt scar? So what is going to be noticeable about this person? Is it the giant 3-carat engagement ring on the hand flashing around? Is it the partially shaved head with the tattoo on the scalp? Is it the and if you start, especially when you get into supporting characters and you want them to be interesting and distinguished from each other, what's going to really stand out that can sort of act as a shorthand, like Weasley's red hair and Hermione's frizzy hair and glasses and Ron's or Harry's lightning bolt scar? Sometimes one trait or one mannerism can function as a kind of calling card. It's a nice shorthand, and everyone at least is agreed in their mental picture on that trait.
Yes.
So that can be nice, especially for supporting characters, where we don't need as much detail as we do with the protagonist. So should we look at some examples and talk about what makes a good description?
Sure.
Yeah, it was challenging, actually, I think, to sort of find that quickly.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to read yours first?
Sure, yeah. This comes from Larry Niven's The Ringworld Engineers. I think I may have mentioned this on a different episode. He wrote a book called Ringworld, which had an enormous amount of science behind it. And then readers promptly told him how wrong all the science was. So he wrote a sequel that he was never intending to write called The Ringworld Engineers. So you'd think that this is hard sci-fi. And you think, well, there's not much need for description in there because it's all about, gravity and ships and weird advanced modern technology. But I thought I'd go, because of the challenge of writing a sequel and bringing the character life straight away, I went right to the very start of it. And it's got some interesting, foreshadowing just in the first few paragraphs. Louis Wu was under the wire when 2 men came to invade his privacy. He was in full lotus position on the lush yellow indoor grass carpet. His smile was blissful, dreamy. The apartment was small, just one big room. He could see both doors, but, lost in the joy that only a wirehead knows, he never saw them arrive. Suddenly there they were, two pale youths, both over 7 feet tall, studying Lewis with contemptuous smiles. One snorted and dropped something weapon-shaped in his pocket. They were stepping forward as Lewis stood up. It wasn't just the happy smile that fooled them. It was the fist-sized drought that protruded like a black plastic canker from the crown of Lewis Wu's head. They were dealing with a current addict, and they knew what to expect. For years, the man must have had no thought but for the wire trickling current into the pleasure centre of his brain. He would be near starvation from self-neglect. He was small, 1.5 feet shorter than either of the invaders. As they reached for him, Lewis bent far sideways for balance, kicked once, twice, thrice. One of the invaders was down, curled around himself and not breathing, before the other found the wit to back away, and the fight goes on. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was interesting because it portrays him. You get this omniscient bit in the middle there where it sort of skips away and tells you what this current addict, electrical addict, would be with this thing plugged in, and he's sitting there all dreamy in this, and you almost get this sense of, because of his name as well, an Asian-based character who's sitting in lotus position, meditating, but hooked into this current and this device in his head, and these two huge, obviously thugs come in unexpectedly, and then he's all of a sudden he's little because he's compared to them, and he's got this thing on his head, but then he kicks the living daylights out of them. So it's kind of interesting that that's all done with very sparse description. You still don't really know what he looks like.
Yeah, and it's also an action scene. The author doesn't pause the action to describe the character. It's woven in, very fluidly. And although we don't know hair color, eye color, we do get a sense of who this guy is by what he's doing, his attitude toward what he's doing, or presumable, the attitude we assume he has. And then that surprise when he responds to the attack. Because you think, he's so spaced out. But he's spaced out.
But actually, no, he's lithe, he's prepared, he's smart. Yes, he's hooked, he's an addict, but he's kind of different to the normal addict. And that all happens in the first four paragraphs. Anyway, so that was mine. Cool. Yeah, I thought he was really sparse in the introduction, but I got a good sense of the scene and who Lewis is. And if you'd not read the first book, then you'd already have a sense of, this guy's a little bit different.
So Lewis is the protagonist?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Yeah.
I think this is a really good example, though, of what to read to. Like you said, the first 4 paragraphs.
Yes.
And I actually, when I was looking, I was realizing I was in the first page or 2 pages of every book that I was looking at. So you could even just go, download a bunch of samples, and just read the first 2 pages of a ton of books and get a really good example of the narrative.
Right. 'Cause with the exception of a prologue, you will be introduced to the protagonist in the first page.
And a good author should give you a sense of who they are immediately, because you want them to attach. You want the reader to attach to your character, because that's what's going to make them read on. There's not going to be much happening. Well, that one starts in media res, but not every story does.
No, but that's a good example of giving us a sense of character in action, and as the protagonist, we know we're going to learn more about him as we read on and get to know him, but that gives us enough to have a sense of who he is, whether or not we're interested in him, while delivering that opening hook and establishing the kind of story this is. You've got the techno and the action layers right there, with the wiring in and the thugs coming in. Yeah, nice. Do you want to go, Kathryn?
Sure. So I have kind of a bit of a different kind of example, which is kind of neat. So I immediately thought about books in which the description of the character, their physical traits, mattered to the plot.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
And so this is actually this is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. And so I'm just going to do just the description part.
Mm-hmm.
But he actually does use the mirror, which cracks me up. But I think he did it well, which is hard to do.
Yeah.
There you go. So it says, Raoden turned, throwing furniture out of his way as he stumbled to the tall mirror at the side of his chambers. The dawn's light had grown just strong enough for him to see the reflection that stared back at him, a stranger's reflection. His blue eyes were the same, though they were wide with terror. His hair, however, had changed from sandy brown to limp gray. The skin was the worst. The mirrored face was covered in sickly black patches like dark bruises. The splotches could mean only one thing. The Shaod had come upon him. And that's...
Oh, nice. Yeah.
That's the hook right there.
Uh-huh.
So his physical description is part of the hook for the plot itself. And another really good example of this that I was looking at, but is like 3 pages of description, is Jacqueline Carey's book, Kushiel's Dart. Because her physical description also matters. And so she's sitting there for pages and pages and pages telling you about her mother and her father and how beautiful she is, and this whole elaborate society that cares about her beauty and the beauty of this and the beauty of that. And then at the end, she has one physical flaw, and that physical flaw is the catalyst for the entire plot. So it's just an interesting... where physical description means something more than just physical description.
Yep.
Right. Huh. That is interesting. So in the one you just read us, what is the thing that comes upon him?
It's called the Shaod, but it's basically a magical illness that he is the crown prince, and so he gets basically banished because of, and then he has to work his way back.
Okay. Yeah.
One of 3 protagonists, because it's Brandon Sanderson and nothing can be simple.
Well, that also takes place. It's in media res again, so there's action happening, there's movement. We're not telling the description. We're showing it for a very good reason. Right. So the mirror trick is not just used to tell us a bit about who John Doe is,
right,
or what John Doe looks like. It's actually, as you say, it's critical key to the plot anyway. Right. But it's also in the middle of action.
Yeah, it's a moment of discovery, and not just for the reader in the sense of an introduction, but for the character. This is very emotional.
Well, it's a perfect example of that exposition as ammunition thing, where the exposition is delivered for a purpose as opposed to just because we want to describe the character. So I think that, to me, has always been the key, how do I drop this in so that it's a part of what's naturally occurring, and it could be an observation, it could be a revelation, it could be a part of the plot. It doesn't matter what it is, but if the only reason I'm doing it is because I want the reader to know what the character looks like, that's not enough.
Right. Well, and it was interesting as I was scrolling through my Kindle I was just looking at titles. Those were the only 2 books that I could actually remember my picture of the main character in my head, because it mattered so much, and because it was done in such a way that was vivid.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that you said they were memorable and vivid, and I think that is key to any description that you write. You don't want it generic, and that's why those key traits or mannerisms can be so important, because we might all have slightly different images of a character, but we're all going to agree on blank, the scar, the red hair, the glasses, whatever that thing is. So those kind of shorthand pieces become memorable, and then the rest of the reader's image of this characters can be built around that, and then you could have great variation from reader to reader, but we all know who that is because of that trait.
And also, look at what happens when they do become memorable, and then it gets changed, not necessarily by the author, but I'm thinking, Tom Cruise bought the film options for all the Jack Reacher novels and put himself in the main characters. Yeah. And Tom Cruise is not a big guy, so the fan base just came out and killed him for doing this. Like Jack Reacher's, he's 7 foot tall. The guy's got shoulders like a linebacker. That's one of the reasons why he beats the living daylights out of all the bad guys, is because he's just built like a tank. You can't hurt Reacher. So cruisers had to really act big in the movies to come across like that, and still he doesn't really quite pull it off. They should have put a really big guy in there, because that's what we all expected. It'd be like casting the Harry Potter novels with a blonde without a scar. So what? Why did you do that?
Yeah, that wouldn't work.
What happened to his glasses? He's meant to be a nerd,
right?
Yeah. Well, I brought a different description. This is deeper into the story. So it's page 11. So it's not deep, but it's after we have established the narrator protagonist and we're meeting the antagonist. So this is Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And this description, especially one sentence in here, has just always stuck with me. It was one of those things where I read it and I had to take a breath and reread the sentence because it was so incredible. All right, so here's the excerpt. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and supercilious manner. 2 shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. So, there we do have narrative exposition, a full-on description, no action. We just have this man standing at the top of the stairs on the porch or terrace outside of this huge manor. But what an image. But
it implies, because it contains value judgments. It's not just, he had straw-coloured hair and he had big shoulders and he was wearing a riding outfit.
Right.
It was what he was doing with that, and he had the supercilious smile and he had the impression of leaning forward and the pack of muscle that shifted under the clothing. And, it's just, it's all happening. And the adjectives of what brought that to life. So I think that's interesting that you could do it just as a full description, but in being very, very heavy with the value judgments, you bring that character to life.
Well, the descriptors, those adjectives you're mentioning, that makes all the difference. If you said he had sandy hair and thin lips and wore riding clothes, okay, whatever. That's forgettable. Right. But when you start to picture the musculature and the aggressive lean and, wow, it becomes a different figure. And you sense the antagonism here at the first meeting. Before he's even spoken a word.
That's right.
Yes. Yeah. And, this is a first-person narrator, so we do get the value judgment. And that's very apparent. We're seeing this guy, Tom Buchanan, through Nick's lens.
Yes.
But you can do that in a close third with an authorial narrator as well, because you're still seeing Tom through Nick's eyes in that moment. So you can still project your point of view characters' value judgments even with the close third point of view.
Right. Well, and I think something that we've kind of gone around maybe, but not, is that you're pick the things that you're going to describe for more than just the reason that you want to describe them. Because even in the one that Robert brought, the engineers one, that I'm forgetting the name, sorry. What we got meant something more than just the fact that he was sitting in a lotus position and that he's the addict, the fact that he's got a wire coming out of his head meant more than just saying he's got a wire coming out of his head. There was more than one reason for that particular descriptor.
Always. It's not just giving the reader a snapshot of a person. It is giving that image meaning whether it's the value judgment on who this guy is, or the peek into the action, that hook, or, you know, I mean, all of this tells us, all of these three descriptions tell us more about the character, and they all play into the plot as well. Because Tom Buchanan isn't just a guy who's really full of himself. He's a guy who's full of himself who plays the role of antagonist. So
exactly.
Yep. All right, we're going to let Robert sign off here, and we'll wrap this up. Thank you.
I have to bow out, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Robert.
Well, and I think it's interesting, both Robert and I picked protagonist and you picked an antagonist description, but like you were saying, like every character is going to have a description, you know, whether they're the main characters or the supplementary characters. And I think that would be a really interesting exercise as I'm reading my next couple books to kind of figure out what couple things get thrown at you when you're dealing with a supplementary character. I'm thinking of a book series I'm reading right now where like one of the supplementary characters, her main thing is fashion. She's like kind of a fashionista that works into her personality. And I'm thinking every description where every time she comes on stage, we get a little bit of what she's wearing, and that's part of who she is.
Right.
And that, you know, and I wouldn't have even thought about that if we hadn't had this conversation, because it's woven in so well that you're just like, oh, here she comes again, you know, and you almost want to know what she's wearing. Because it matters to the plot and to who she is and to how she interacts with the characters around her. But it's also the visual lens that we get of who she is.
Yeah, and I think it's important not just to look at the opening pages of a book. Those are great, as we were saying before, for getting the introduction of the protagonist. And then as you get that introduction, analyze it, say, okay, why am I seeing the wire out of the head? Or why is he looking in a mirror? Or what is significant about these elements here? Why are they coming to me first? But then also deeper into stories, see how other characters are introduced. And assume there's going to be a value judgment. What do we need to know about this person, and why is it important? And that can be a positive value, like the sidekick or best friend character, but we're seeing that she's a computer geek, so we know she's going to support the hero with the technology stuff, right?
Right, exactly.
What is the author drawing forward right away for us? Right. And, you know, in the case of the Gatsby excerpt, it's evoking a lot of feeling there, a lot of mood. Like, wow, I wouldn't want to hang out with Tom Buchanan. He looks like a jerk. He hasn't even spoken yet, but
you immediately hate him.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because a very strong emotion to feel towards a character when they've just been introduced, but it's immediate. So.
Yeah. So any other thoughts about strong character descriptions? So, okay, let's try to summarize here and tie this up a little bit. Pay attention to character introductions when you encounter them in fiction. Notice what elements the author is presenting first and why. Notice how you respond to those elements as a reader. Is it a hook, like an action-driven hook? Is it an emotional hook? Do you immediately feel like, you know, put on the brakes here? This is and practice crafting that into your own character descriptions. So, you know, if you go do the people watching exercise, look at somebody and let yourself make that value judgment. Is that someone I would want to have coffee with? Okay, why or why not? What about this appearance just gave me that reaction?
Right.
Write it down. Exactly. There's your homework. Write it down. All right. That is it for this week's show. Thank you for listening. And we could use your rates, your reviews, your questions. Join us on Facebook. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.